Welcome to the Quark and Roll podcast. I am your host, Kwok Pui Lan. Today's guest is Dr. Raimundo Barreto, who teaches world Christianity at Princeton Theological Seminary in New Jersey. In this episode, you will learn about the development of Latin American Christianity, as well as new directions in the study of world Christianity. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Pui Lan. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with you.
Since United States bombed Venezuela, people in the States have been very concerned about the relationship between the U.S. and Latin America. As someone from Brazil who has studied Latin American Christianity, can you share with us some of your reflections of the political situation today?
U.S. citizens were concerned with the attack on Venezuela. We Latin Americans were even more concerned because we have a history with the United States. And it was not only the unprecedented nature of this violent attack, a military operation on Latin American soil, and the capture of a president of one of the Latin American states, but the discourse that came along with that. This morning, I was reading a Brazilian newspaper in which the headline was about the Ministry of War, as they call it in Brazil, and the new doctrine towards Latin America. So it's the replication and the resurrection of the Donroe Doctrine, now with the D instead of the M, the Donroe, as Donald Trump should say. But it's a doctrine that we know well of imperialism, of domination, of control on economic resources and political control of the continent, but with a new element that I would say it's naked power. There is no mask. There is no justification. It's not about democracy. It's not about human rights, as in the past you would say. It's about oil. It's about the U.S. interests and the overcome of Chinese influence on Latin America, or the pure control of Latin American resources, including the rare minerals, oil, and gas. So this is very concerning because the attack on Venezuela was not only on Venezuela. It was accompanied by a war against other Latin American countries, explicitly a warning against Colombia, Mexico, Cuba, and anyone who doesn't align with the U.S. interests in Latin America. So this is a very concerning situation, and we know it's being explicitly spelled as a new policy of domination and control, of spheres of influence, and it is connected to everything else that we are hearing, including the idea of possessing Greenland. So it's the whole hemisphere and an area of influence that is behind this attack, and it's a message that was sent not only to Venezuela itself, but to the whole continent.
That is why I find your book, Engaging Coloniality, the Liberating Story of Christianity in Latin America, particularly timely and pertinent. There is a section about liberative stories in Latin America in the 21st century. Can you share with us some of the themes of that particular section?
Going back a little bit about the story of this book, which I may show it here, is a collection of essays in an attempt to tell the story of Latin American Christianity from a decolonial perspective. As I say that in the introduction, differently from Asia, differently from Africa, in Latin America, Christianity came first as part of an European expansion, as part of conquest and colonization. So that was the first phase of Christianity that we met. And the ideology behind what was called then the first evangelization was an ideology of replacement, cultural replacement, people's replacement, civilization's replacement, and religious replacement as well. So we tend to hear the story of Latin American Christianity, and I think throughout the many decades, at least, in which we have seen books telling that story, usually it's told from a missionary perspective. Even when I studied the history of Christianity in Latin America, in Brazil, 3 decades ago, we would study in Latin America the history of Latin American Christianity as almost an appendix to a global history of Christianity that would come through Europe and then the United States and then Latin America. And everything that we could learn about what was happening in Latin America would be basically a kind of a complement to what had been done, an extension of what had been done in that missionary history. But the fact is that despite the intentions of creating a Christian continent, and that Latin America was the earliest non-Western region of the world to be declared Christian. It was Christianized in the early days of modernity, coloniality. And then, so when we see that idea of a Christianization of the continent, the idea was to replace the local religions with Christianity and to bring a new civilization, but that's not what happened. So what happened is that along with that ideology, there were people, there were cultures, there were civilizations, there were communities, and people had their own agency and responded to that. So the attempt that we make in this book is to tell that story of those encounters, to tell the story of how people received, translated, responded to these encounters. And the book goes all the way back to the Nahua people and how the missionaries intended to evangelize them, how they interpret the message, how they process the message in their own culture, moving to what you highlight, which is the 21st century, when we see other forms of Latin American Christianity emerging, and I would say a come of age of Latin American Christianity. I have to say that this is only possible because of what happened in the 20th century. So in the 20th century, we see among Protestants and Catholics in Latin America, the beginning of a quest about what does it mean to be Christian and Latin American. So that self-awareness, Latin America is a created identity. It didn't exist before. Even to this day, it's a contested identity. Many people in the region call the land Abya and other indigenous names, but this identity of Latin America, which came with the colonization of the region, also has been processed through indigenous lenses. And in the 20th century, that question was posed by our early ecumenical Protestants since the 1920s. What does it mean to be Protestant and Latin American? And then also by Catholics who also were claiming that identity. That is what gave birth to local contextual Latin American theologies that have been influential also in other parts of the world, including liberation theology, but also gave birth to many forms and shapes of Christianity that claim to be Latin American in its identity. In that section, section 3, the section starts with a chapter that I write on the rise of the idea of Christian unity and reconciliation in the region. So the idea of ecumenism, which is a 20th century movement in the region, which led many people to rethink this idea of how could we be Christians in the region. So the ecumenical movement in Latin America is not a movement that is led towards more abstract or even more theological conversations about Christian difference, doctrinal differences. Is more about how can we respond to the circumstances in which we live together. And that was a question that in the 50s and 60s brought together for the first time Catholics and Protestants to respond to the dire situation of mass poverty, land accumulation, imperialism, and all sorts of injustice through united efforts that brought Christians together, but also in the sense of reconciliation. The reconciliation was not something only among Christians, but reconciliation with other people, reconciliation with those who had been marginalized, reconciliation with those who had been excluded, reconciliation with the land, and a broader repositioning of Christianity in the land as something that was not part of violent project of invasion, but was now embraced and transformed by those living in the region. More recently, we have seen what Gustavo Gutierrez termed as the eruption of the poor. The poor was a big umbrella in Gustavo Gutierrez's theology, but the impoverished persons and peoples, they have faces, they have bodies, and in the recent decades, they have emerged a form of movements that represent different faces and bodies of those who have been oppressed and marginalized in the continent. Theologically, it represents the rise of women's theologies, of indigenous theologies, or even, in many ways, popular religion and some sorts of Pentecostalism that have reread the tradition in the Bible in ways that are more in connection with the realities of the continent.
I would like to congratulate you for receiving the prestigious Luke Mulberry Ecumenical Award from the American Baptist Church in the United States. And you have also edited a new book that talks about base ecumenism. We talk about base Christian community from Latin America for some time, but your book talks about base ecumenism, Latin American contribution to ecumenical praxis and theology. And it is very well received. Can you share some of the main themes?
Thank you so much for the congratulations. Yeah, this award came from the American Baptist churches and in recognition of my practical involvement on the ecumenical movement. And I preface what I'm going to say with that to explain first my attraction to this theme. I grew up in an environment that was almost anti-ecumenical, a very closed environment in which ecumenism was perceived through a very negative lens, very conservative in many ways. And there was always that sense of loneliness. And I grew up, I'm old enough and I'm giving away my age here. I grew up still during the last long dictatorship in Brazil, which ended in 1985. And during those years, the necessity to be together with others and responding to the imminent needs that we all faced in the nation led me to look for others who were also responding to this from different churches and different traditions, and made me think about ecumenism from a very practical perspective, including the fact that it was the ecumenical movement through what they call the accompaniment and the support offered to those who were under persecution, being imprisoned, tortured, some of them even killed by the authoritarian regime, who also saved the documents that were so helpful later for the Truth Committee in Brazil. That was the face of ecumenism that really attracted me as an ecumenism of presence. A presence that helped people feel that they were not alone in their struggle. So I embraced and became an ecumenical Christian in Latin America through those experiences. And I have turned that into scholarly interest, trying to understand the ecumenical movement. And in this book, it's a monograph that I wrote and published last year. I try to tell that story from two perspectives. One is an attempt to tell the story of ecumenism in Latin America, to understand how ecumenism began and how it was shaped in the continent, and bringing this perspective, especially of an ecumenism that was based on solidarity and presence, and how transformative that presence was, even in terms of shaping a number of social movements. And movements also that led to theological initiatives, like, as I mentioned, the rise of liberation theologies in the 1960s. The other lens I was looking at this was how what was happening in Latin America and the other parts of the world helped shape the ecumenical conversations in the international arena. And that's why I emphasized what is called in Latin America ecumenismo de base, or base ecumenism. Because I wanted to tell this story not from the top down, but from a perspective of the grassroots, of the movements that were happening on the ground, which were shaping ideas and also shaping conversations within the continent and outside in the larger arenas. So I begin the story with the formation of the ecumenical instruments of the 20th century after the World Missionary Conference in Edinburgh 1910, which excluded Latin America. And in response to that exclusion of Latin America, there was another congress that was organized by missionary agencies in 1916 in Panama, which was planned through the lens of Pan-Americanism, an agenda that was at the same time missionary then and political, in which the unity of Latin America was preached from a U.S. perspective. So this Congress was not organized by Latin Americans, was in English, not in Spanish or Portuguese, was not led by Latin Americans. But for the first time, it created the opportunity for a young generation of Latin American Protestant leaders to be in conversation with the leaders of these missionary agencies that were bringing all the participants together. It was in that context and the following developments after that conference, with other regional conferences taking place in different parts of Latin America, that the conversations about a Latin American agenda for the development of Protestantism in the region began to be shaped. And so questions about land and the history of Latin America is a history of land accumulation, of land dispossession. So it became part of the agenda of this initially Protestant, but ecumenical Protestant meeting in places like Montevideo, Uruguay, or Ana in 1929 in Cuba. The issues of social justice in terms of serving the most vulnerable, responding to situations of disparity began to be part of the agenda. And this was creating an agenda that was leading towards that question: what does it mean to be a Protestant in Latin America? In light of that conversation, and in light of what would happen a little later, which was a clear self-awareness that the recipe of the empires for the region was not working, because instead of the promised development that was attached to the idea of Pan-Americanism, we were having violence, we were having a greater economic disparity, including the fact that we had mass poverty. And the priests and pastors and lay people who began to organize movements to respond to those situations, some focusing on labor, some focusing on education, some focusing on rural workers and the agrarian, the land issues. So those movements came together to form and change an ecumenism that was not coming from those external societies or missionary agencies that we saw gathering and creating that first meeting in 1916, but now from an experience with the realities of the region. So this is what leads towards a change in the view of the church, which through the influence of people like Paulo Freire, in the necessity to listen to those who have been excluded from the benefits of society, generated a movement first among Catholics, the Christian-based communities, a church emerging from poor communities, but also, almost at the same time, experiments happening among Protestants who are much less, because Protestantism was tiny, very small, in contrast to today in the region, but was happening as also an experiment of being a church outside the church. So they had Protestant students going to factories and living together with workers and trying to create community and organizations to address the challenges that a growing urban setting was experiencing in places like São Paulo, Campinas, or Rio de Janeiro. And these movements beginning to shape the questions that were being asked in theological circles. Those questions were brought by some of the Brazilian priests and bishops to the Vatican II, some questions were brought to Protestant ecumenical gatherings and more broadly, other ecumenical gatherings. In the Vatican too, Donroe da Câmara, a bishop from Brazil, tried to speak with the Pope to say this should be the agenda of the council. And even though that was not the case, he and others who formed the Church of the Poor group made a commitment to actually enact what had been said in the words of John the 23rd, prior to the Vatican II, a church of the poor and for the poor, a phrase that has been part of the Christian praxis and message since then, that we heard also in the words of Pope Francis, and we see present in many forms and shapes around the globe.
This is so fascinating because this is a story that we may not have heard or we seldom thought about those particular contributions from Latin America. Now, you are a scholar of world Christianity and you have organized a lot of conferences on different perspectives of Christianity from a global lens. Can you share with us some of the new directions as you see it in the study of world Christianity?
So world Christianity is very helpful and has been helpful as a lens, as an approach to me, because it explicitly challenges historians, theologians, and other scholars of religion to pay attention to the different expressions and forms of Christianity, or which Christianity has taken in different cultures and places around the world. Its original impulse was one towards the indigeneity of Christianity in the works of people like Andrew Walls and Lamsana, paying attention not to missionary transmission, but actually to translation, to reception, to the encounter of the gospel with the different cultures and with the embodiment of Christianity in many countries and languages and so forth, and how that impacted the shape of Christianity in the world today, especially with the drastic demographic changes happening with the growth of Christianity in the continent of Africa, the transformations have been talking about in Latin America, or even the growth of Christianity in many places in Asia, in other parts of the world, the migration and the impact of those diasporic communities coming from the South and former colonized spaces and countries now to their former colonizers and shaping and changing Christianity in those spaces. So this has been like the origin of the conversation, which of course were also enriched by the contributions of people like Dana Robert and the realization of the centrality and role of women in shaping Christianity is a historical thing, but it's very evident today in all these countries and cultures where Christianity is growing, how many of these churches are comprised mostly by women, and also through the feminization of migration, the leading role that women taking and playing in host communities in different parts of the world, and how that shapes also churches and networks and relationships and even Christian theology. But I would say that in the past few years, we have realized that those indigenous stories cannot be told in isolation. So we moved from a time when those stories were totally invisible, were not actually mentioned, were erased, were silenced, and Christianity, that's why world Christianity, it sounds like redundant, but whenever we mention Christianity only, as Dale Irvin likes to say, we are referring to a very particular kind of Christianity, which was Eurocentric and which saw itself as universal. World Christianity has shifted our attention to all these other developments taking place and how they are also shaping what we call Christianity. We ended up going to a place where a lot of the work done in the field was actually restoring and recovering these local histories. It's the interconnection in the interconnectedness of those stories. So there is a growing attention to the relationship between what was happening in South Africa and what was happening in India, what was happening in the Caribbean, what was happening in the US among Black churches and what was happening in South Africa, what was happening in Nigeria and in Brazil. So those connections are part of this. And this is situating my work is what we can call a kind of a new ecumenism. An ecumenism that's not centered on an Eurocentric agenda. It's not centered on histories of division and splits in Christianity that were mostly related to one experience, one story of Christianity, but not to many others. It pays attention to contemporary issues, and the things that divide us today are not the same necessarily that divided us 100 years ago when the Edinburgh Conference and the Panama Conference were happening. So which are the new challenges that we face today? And how can we talk about unity and difference? How can we talk about the one and the many? How can we talk about the connections between the local and the global, and the interconnectedness between regional stories? So I think this is taking more space and more interest among many scholars of world Christianity. Just to mention this, in March, on March 9 through the 13th, we will have a World Christianity Conference in Brazil, in the city of Recife, where we'll be discussing exactly these entanglements, interconnectedness, networks, relationships that I would say comprise of a fuller version of world Christianity and also a new kind of ecumenism.
I wish you a very successful conference. And thank you very much, Raimundo, for joining the podcast today. If you find this episode helpful, please subscribe. I will see you in the next episode.